Welcome to HarmonyTALK, a podcast about dreamers and doers. We talk with people from many different backgrounds, athletes, artists, authors, business and community leaders about how they've gone from dreaming to doing. This podcast is sponsored by AM Skyer, a third-generation insurance company started in 1920. Honored to be hosting this episode. I'm Todd Stevens. My guest today is Jim Weiss. Jim is founder and chairman of Real Chemistry, a global marketing, communication, and analytics firm with a focus on the healthcare industry. Jim, great to have you. Welcome to the program.
Good to see you, Todd. How's it going?
It's going great. I'm very excited to have you here today. You know, there's so much going on in the world of healthcare and communications, how we hear about healthcare, if you will, and how we react to it. It seems to be the conversation, whether we're talking about business, politics, or around the dinner table at home. Can you tell us what role Real Chemistry plays in today's complex healthcare environment?
Well, I think a simple way to put where Real Chemistry fits is how do we help companies and organizations tell a story that resonates with their key stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem. So it's everyone from patients to FDA to other regulators around the world, other advocacy groups that they need to partner with. Obviously, insurers, that's a big piece of it. Cost is an issue. Given your business, you understand, that piece of it. And there's nothing more important than your health. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had a piece about the differential in pricing between us here in the US and Europe and other parts of the world, but was praising the concept and saying, we should be glad America pays for this because that also pays for innovation. And I think one of our jobs is to really help this very interesting and dedicated and awesome industry tell its story better and in a way that helps them achieve their business goals. So I'm really very strict about this around here, at this company, because I came from the in-house world, working at Genentech in-house, working at Sanofi in-house, working at a company J&J bought in the medical device space in-house. And it's all about helping companies achieve their business goals and ends, but doing so in a way that does some good for the patients and the caregivers that ultimately are the beneficiaries of their innovations.
So it sounds like Real Chemistry's role in the piece is really telling the story, whether it's pharma or getting the message out as to, how patients can benefit, how health networks operate, and kind of keeping that message flowing throughout the country, throughout the world.
I have a bias about communications. I think everybody thinks they're an expert at it, and that's fine. I think our job and role is to help these companies, products, organizations act as leaders, because in my view, that bias is leadership is communications, communications is leadership. And if you do a good job at that, that will help your business do better. And you and I both know, coming from a small town, it was important that we didn't walk by people on the street, that create partnership, that didn't create customers, that didn't create goodwill. You had to, we knew everybody, and that was just the way it worked. And that usually led to much better outcomes in life and in business.
Absolutely. And you talk about communications being so much of really the kind of the culture of how we grew up as small town people, and getting into the business, as you mentioned, Genentech, Sanofi. When you struck out and founded Real Chemistry, as I mentioned, you're the founder and chairman. You seem to be pretty upwardly mobile already in the world of pharma. What prompted you to kind of take that risk?
I've always told it like it is around that. I've felt that communications, while I, of course, put the highest value on it, I can't say every corporation or boardroom does. I think they may do it now, but my view was I wasn't going to become CEO at any of those places because of the sort of discipline in which I sat. And whether I did more investor relations or corporate communications, I felt like the typical person that would end up leading a bioscience or life science company, pharma company, would be coming from the marketing world, would be coming from the R&D side of the business, maybe once in a while a lawyer, maybe once in a while a CFO, but very rarely a communications leader. And I'd say the closest we've come is Merck's Ken Frazier, who was the chief counsel, but also ran communications there for many years and then rose to the top. And I think just saying, the success he had and the admiration and respect he garnered had a lot to do with his communication skills and valuing that discipline. So anyway, my thought was, let me go out and find my own way and see where it takes me. I certainly knew a lot of people in the business through that process. I knew what I did was valuable, and my clients certainly said that and proved that. And that's how I got going. I just thought this is a better route to a bigger future for me.
Were you ever worried, hey, what if this doesn't work? What do I do next?
I'm still worried about that. I think, you got to act like you're being chased. You got to act like you're not going to have it tomorrow. My mom used to say, the moment you think you've arrived, it's time to leave. Obviously, you asked me about role models and some of the material you sent, and she was a big role model. You knew her well, Sally Weiss, and my dad was similar. They were the kind of people that taught me what public service and citizenship was and how important that was. And I think that informed how I've evolved my business over the years, learning along the way. But I would say, I don't think I was ever afraid. In the sense that I think I had healthy fear. I didn't have paralyzed fear, right? I knew enough not to cross the street when the traffic lights were going in the wrong direction. But that's the key. You can't be stupid, fearless. You kind of have to be a little fearful, but not too much.
And I want to talk about your mom and dad and mentors in a minute, but do you remember when you were kind of charting your own course with Weiss Communications and moving into W2O, leading up to Real Chemistry, when you stepped out on your own, do you remember that first deal or the first commitment you got from a customer that you kind of thought, geez, this might work?
Yes. I mean, I absolutely do remember it. I had actually a couple guys call me. First of all, when I left my last corporate job, they did ask me, to stay to turn off the lights, which I thought was great, as that was bought by another company. And they did say, hey, part of the deal, you'll consult for 6 months. So that gave me a little courage, to go out there and try this, because I knew I'd have that as a backstop. And I can't say I didn't look at corporate opportunities over the years, but what happened was I would go visit people at their places of new companies from all over the Bay Area. And a lot of times they were saying, hey, come in-house. Why don't you come back? And I was saying, I'm just trying to figure out what the right next thing would be. And slowly but surely, while I was carrying 6 or 7 business cards of these individual companies, I realized, there's a real business to be created here. So I wouldn't say it was just one. It was probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in quick succession that made me realize within a year, wow, this can really happen at a bigger scale.
Wow. And in that year, how did that feel when you realized, hey, I'm getting some traction here? This is working. This is, you're bringing people on board.
I would say a little overwhelming. It was a lot. It was too much to take on alone, which is why I needed to create a business and find what I call my +4. I mean, I didn't know it was my +4 then, but this concept of I need 4 go-to clients to keep all the lights on, and I need 4 go-to people right on my team who can help me execute it. But my wife was sitting next to me, in the basement of my loft in those years. She would come in and her calm, cool self doing consulting, did a great job for 2 or 3 clients, had it totally dialed, had them totally trained. And I was chasing everything, promising 24/7 in the contract and totally hair on fire, where she was calm, cool, collected and did great, and clients chased her down. So I did learn some things sitting next to her. And then eventually we did one project together, which lasted 6 weeks. And she was like, we'll never do this again. And not too long after, we got pregnant with my son, and she decided, I think this is my time to go, and you get going here, go full force. And I got the house.
Wow. It's a great story. And understanding your wife, Audra, we'll talk about also in a minute. You mentioned something there you learned from her. You're running around with your head on fire, so to speak. How important was that partnership early on?
Oh, it's everything. I know I talk to a lot of people I mentor. Having strong home partnership allows you to be an entrepreneur. I don't think you can do it alone. It's really hard, especially if you're going to have kids and all of that. And that's a business in and of itself, right? So at one point after the second one, we had to figure out and make a truce that said, okay, you got the house, I got the business. We won't tell each other what to do in those. You're the CEO here, I'm the CEO there. And I think that actually really was a foundational and important way to view things going forward. And, we don't get that confused as to who does what. I find that clarity is important in client relationships. It's really important in home relationships too.
Yeah, absolutely. Great lesson learned there for sure. And in building your own company and learning all that you've learned, as you just mentioned, some of your early wins, if you will, do you consider yourself a maverick in this industry? You think you've done a little differently than most traditional paths have been created in this industry?
I mean, I'd like to think so. I was just talking to someone about this actually. The truth of the matter is, everybody has this sense that they're the first people to do this thing, and chances are they aren't. And so I think I learned over the years that that wasn't the case, but I'm sure I approached it as a maverick. And yes, I did do things somewhat differently, but I always have. I tend to defy the odds. I'm a bit underestimated. My favorite documentary is the one on Steph Curry, underrated or whatever the exact title is. But the concept being people didn't see it coming. That's why I love this 49ers story of Brock Purdy, because he comes in at the very end and defies odds and works real hard. And, I think quietly from the back rises. I felt that happened for me back in Honesdale High School for many years. I did my thing. And then suddenly, kapow, I was there as the president of student council. I don't think people entirely saw it coming or knew it. And I've talked to old college colleagues that would say we didn't really see it coming with you with this success and growth that I've had. I think what it is, it's just what I was taught where we grew up. Do what you say you're going to do. That was the bottom line. I put it out there so that I would have to do it. And that's what Make It Happen is all about. It's that integrity of delivery that's so important, because vision without execution is hallucination. That's really the quote in my head that drives me. A lot of people have the vision, and a lot of companies and businesses have the intent, or at least the desire, but you have to have that intent to deliver on the promise. And I think that's where I feel like this firm and my colleagues have excelled. We made it happen. And it's not like it's new conceptually, it's just we did it. You can't just think it, you got to do it. And so I think that's really the differentiator.
Yeah, and execution so critical because, nothing happens until that client says yes, the work is done, the check comes in. There's some critical things that have to happen. We've talked a lot about the doing part of Jim Weiss, if you will. You mentioned Honesdale High School, where you went to high school, and the small town where we had both grown up, actually. And I'd like to just ask you about young Jim Weiss back in that small town. You're a West Coast guy now. You've had a lot of success in the corporate world, but was the young Jim Weiss thinking, someday I'm going to be the CEO and start my own company and move to the West Coast? Or what was in young Jim Weiss's mind?
I would say yes, absolutely. I thought I was going to do more than what maybe was entirely expected, but I shouldn't say that. I mean, my mom and dad always used to say, you can do anything you set your mind to. And I had a lot of great mentors, right? And colleagues and people to look up to. This podcast is Henry Skyers, but he revered my grandfather, Sam Scher, who had a business that my mom ended up running. So I had a lot of terrific role models within my growing up that were entrepreneurial, that were leadership. And my dad ran his own optometry practice that had multiple locations at one point. And then when I look around, there were a lot of entrepreneurs all around, from your dad to Tom Glinsky to so many through my friends that I knew who had their own businesses, who used to talk about that. The Saders, as you know, they had Cott's Underwear Company. And so we certainly knew, and one of my great mentors was Martha Sader, who recently passed away, Henry Skyers' dad and family. So when I look around at the people that I knew and was surrounded by, we had an unusual group of high achievers, right, who expected A+ or nothing from school and everything else. And I think it's hard to say that there was any other thing but those influences that formed it. So I always thought achievement was possible. And I don't think that's unusual with small town people, because again, people look at you, you create a little chip on your shoulder. There's guys out there. When I finally got out to Syracuse, and, my sister went to private school at Wyoming Seminary. So you saw a whole other socioeconomic group over there that, I stayed at Honesdale High, but I kind of felt like we really unusually, it was one of those towns that had a ethos almost as the county seat of Wayne County, right? That had that amazing courthouse that was like a movie set. I think that it was unusual. And I think that did inform where I am and where I'm going, I think, really powerfully.
Yeah, that small town upbringing, walking down the street, you don't just walk past people, you say hello. And the fact that you wind up in communications and leverage that experience is interesting. And I think I share that as well. It's just one of those things you learn that if you grow up in a larger area, you may not pick up on so quickly. And although some folks may have advantages in one area, certainly small town folks have their advantages in others. Were you known as you came up in the corporate world as, that guy from a small town or that guy from Syracuse or no?
No, everybody thought my name was Jeff and that I was from New Jersey or New York. Nobody, or Philadelphia. I don't think anybody ever thinks, but what's not unsurprising, and Henry Schuyler has a lot to do with that too, is that many of the kids I went to college with and met in New York City went to camp in our region. So that's another impact. And, my family had a camp called Tyler Hill, and they sold that to the owners. And I think now there's new owners. But the point is, I bought a company called Star Power that's part of our family of companies. And two of the principals went to camp at Tyler Hill. And so they felt quite related to me. My family's house was on that property and they knew who they were. Of course, we were 2.5 hours from New York. People had moved from Scranton and New York. And remember, Scranton, where a lot of our people were from, that was at one point on the map. Every old movie has someone stopping in Scranton for performances and things like that. And there were plenty of notable people that came from there. And then when you think that extends to politics, and there's this guy, I think he's in the White House now, right? If you believe everything you read. I don't know that everybody does. But the truth is, that's interesting to see, a guy from Scranton in the White House. So, and as it turned out, when I actually at one point coincidentally met Joe Biden, we talked about where we were born, right? We were both born at Mercy Hospital. So there's this sense that there's something about that place, too. Scranton and Honesdale and that whole neck of the woods. And then Joel Roos, who grew up, Paula Roos's son, who's out here, and I see him a lot. We always say, all roads lead to Honesdale when you really start to put it together. So, yeah, I think it's so fundamental. And look, I always tell the story, but Ned Sater sent me a letter that Martha had put in a drawer that he found after she passed. And he sent it to me on text, where I thanked her for dressing me down at a horse show where I was not expressing great sportsmanship. And it was one of those moments where there's no crying in horseback riding. It was like, stop whining, buck up, move on.
What had happened that day?
I think I didn't win the champion medal. Whatever it was, I was pissed off and not a great sport about it, and kind of went off in a huff. And she came over and said, that's not cool. And, you're going to win as much as you lose or come in second. And winning is doing that well. And you got to learn how to do it. So she was like, you got to buck up and be a better sport and not show any emotion around that kind of thing. And I thought it was a really great lesson that stuck with me forever. But I did write her a letter right soon afterwards.
Wow. I'm guessing, and not dating ourselves, but I'm assuming that was more than 40 years ago.
It sure was. Yeah. I had stopped riding and training horses at 13 or 14, because that's when we started going and doing golf team and basketball, and you really couldn't do all this stuff. It was a way to work. I mean, I had a job. It was a way to get me out of the house on the weekends, cleaning stalls and looking after the animals and breaking in hard horses to ride. And no, that was a great, great formative thing in my life. So that's the stuff, right? The role models that are so important.
Absolutely. And the lessons learned, which we touched on before. You mentioned your mom and dad before, Doc and Sally Weiss. I did know them both, was honored to know them both. And I think I mentioned this to you before, but your dad, just a wonderful personality, a trusted doc that people would go to, and they've needed to get the eyes examined, and just a wonderful, wonderful guy. And your mom always struck me as someone who was not only intelligent and classy, but so well refined What was it like growing up with, your father, certainly an entrepreneur, and your mom, in the family company is, I believe she was president of your family company. What was that like growing up with a mom who was also a leader in her own right?
Oh, it was interesting. It's taken a lot of years and maybe they're passing for me to appreciate some of the things that was. I mean, we all have our ups and downs with our parents, and, it wasn't always perfect. But when I look back and say, what are the fundamental things that make me tick and basic life values and lessons that I think they taught me were great, particularly the one around citizenship that I mentioned. I mean, they both played big roles in the town around raising money for Temple Beth Israel or Lions Club or the JCs or on and on. I mean, they really set the example by doing and not talking about it. I felt like that's the lesson they taught me around that, which was you don't just talk about giving back or doing good, you do it. That's the way you show it. You do it through citizenship. And I also think they pushed me, like so many of us got pushed by our parents, to be better and do the best we could, be good sports about it. Like I said, it was not always easy or peaceful. I thankfully had my grandfather, Sam Scher, down the street, who my grandmother for a long time that were 2 blocks away, which is a rare but great privilege. And he was a haven in a storm if they were fighting or not seeing eye to eye or giving me a hard time or my brother a hard time or my sister a hard time, which is all the realities of growing up. Nothing's perfect, but I always felt like they were good friends to the people they were friends with. They were characters, people knew who they were. They spoke their mind for the most part. They didn't really worry about what people thought of them. And I thought that was a big lesson to learn. You can't walk around worrying about that.
So much of what you're saying, it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, which is leadership is action, not position. You can lead from any level, whether you're a business owner or you're a kid learning from their parents. You can step out, but it's the action piece that seems to be missing a lot when people talk about leadership, making it happen.
It's everything I know.
And you mentioned Syracuse earlier, and I have to ask you about your affinity for your alma mater, Syracuse University. You and your wife, Audra, I assume you met there?
We did not. We did not know each other. No, it's a fun story. And it is a woman from Honesdale who set us up. Audra grew up in Long Island, did a Jersey Shore house summer share with our good old friend, Lynn Galinsky. And it was Lynn that actually connected me with her after we both graduated and were both out in the working world. And I didn't know her at Syracuse. She's a couple years younger. And she did the business major, but ended up in the same business, not just communications, but health communications, healthcare and pharma communications at another firm. And I didn't know her for a while until Lynn introduced us.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. When you're preparing to talk to someone like yourself, you think you do enough research, but some things just slip through the cracks. That's a great story, though. I'm so glad you shared that.
Yeah, it's one of these when Harry met Sally stories. My dad gave a very funny toast at our wedding where he would say, there was this girl hanging around and I didn't know who she was to Jim and what was going to happen. And every once in a while I'd see her, I had heart surgery and she was around, and then she'd be at some family event. But he would never really say what his intentions were, and then finally close the deal. But it was one of these things where it took a little while for everything to land. And I got married relatively late. We're dating from the time I was around 30 or 31, but I didn't finally walk down the aisle till 35.
But you still took action.
I finally made it happen. One of the best, thank God, because it's been a very important stabilizing force.
That's wonderful. And she and you, your affinity for Syracuse, you have the Weiss Center for Communications at the Newhouse School. Can you tell us a little bit about what made you think about, let me give back here? What was the creation of that?
Well, whenever you're giving, you're taking. So the real truth of the matter is that when I did it, I was a relatively lesser known business, and healthcare was not a place most people naturally went into. And I did not imagine I would. I sort of stumbled into it. I always tell people I started at the bottom, because when I came out of college and I did an internship where the product I worked on was a barium enema product, don't ask how that even happened, right? Through connections, I got that gig. And then because that was on my resume, my first job out of college was working on Metamucil and Pepto-Bismol when P&G bought those products and relaunched them. So I always tell people I did really truly start at the bottom in the most literal sense. But the way this all transpired for me was kind of, again, taking advantage. I always say connections and who you know are almost way more important than what you know. And then, of course, once you're in, you have to show you know what you're doing. But it was all that connectivity that actually got me here. And because when I started the business and we were really somewhat unknown, and kids, again, did not naturally choose healthcare communications as most would come out wanting probably to do communications for stars or music or sports or all these other sexier, what seemed like sexier areas. I thought I needed to go the extra mile. So I went to Syracuse really in many ways to establish the program. And it was Gary Grates who had joined me right around that time and was an alumnus. And Jen Gottlieb, who was my president, was an alumnus. And of course, my wife was. So it seemed like a natural place to go to recruit and get people at that early phase and infect them and inject them with a little bit of knowledge about what healthcare and pharmaceutical communications could mean. And then I could do some giving back in terms of teaching about it, but also being there and showing them, hey, come here. And remember, I went there and remembered that the firms that showed up on campus were the ones you knew about. And it's not rocket science. So, we got that going and then it grew. And the woman that was running the school at the time, Lorraine Branham, who's since passed from a very devastating and fast moving cancer, and I miss her a lot, was one of the few Black deans of any college at that time. We had a vision of creating more diversity and inclusion and getting more kids of all types into communications generally. And then, of course, healthcare communications more specifically. So that was the impetus. I was looking to recruit, and I still recruit out. I think we've recruited hundreds, and we just did a post on LinkedIn about all the different folks that have gone through it. Big impact on my business and theirs.
Well, that's great. And I saw at one point in the past, you had come out to the Newhouse School to give a talk. And I think it was a Sunday or it was a day the school was closed. And, I don't think that they were expecting a huge audience. And you packed the place. It was a full auditorium. These kids were just right with the feeling of, I want to learn from this guy. So that must have been a great feeling.
It was great, but also I was smart about knowing when people might come out. You had to schedule it. I remembered, what day would I actually go do something like this? And it's like, Sunday's a throwaway day. I got to go study at some point. So I'll get some extra credit. You weren't going out those days, and usually there were no sporting events. So there wasn't a lot of competition.
Smart. That's a great story. And it's wonderful that you're giving back and creating the leaders of tomorrow, especially in the field of communications. I don't think it's necessarily top of mind when kids are entering school. They might have a knack for it. Yeah, I can talk to people. I understand things conceptually. Wow, communications doesn't necessarily pop all the time. So that's wonderful. Kudos to you and Audra for what you're doing there.
Well, it's a good example of giving back and getting in the same way, right? You give and you get. You don't get much if you don't give.
Right. Absolutely. Completely agree. You put a lot of time into nonprofits. Obviously, you're still involved very much so with Real Chemistry. What does downtime look like for Jim Weiss?
Music. We have my brother plays in that local concert that we've been going to for years and supporting back east, that. But, most of it is Grateful Dead related. I really enjoy getting out and seeing that. I just got my tickets for Dead and Company at the Sphere in Vegas. Excited about that. I'm going to see U2 at the Sphere in Vegas this weekend when I go to the Super Bowl. I'm out and about. I think I like a lot of work and I like to socialize and go to sporting events, and you'll find me often hanging around the Warriors out here. I love that team and I enjoyed it for couple decades, win, lose, draw. The Giants have been fun to watch here. So I would say sports, music. I do get out on the golf course. I played on our golf team, as you know, and I have a lot of friends in the field. And my brother was a great golfer and is a great golfer. So, I get out. That's one of my chosen recreations. And I have a great golf course out here I belong to in San Francisco called Lake Merced. Those are the kind of things I do. That's the downtime. I don't like a lot of downtime. I like to be running hard.
Well, what's your work-life balance?
I've never believed that that's a thing. I think life is a balancing act, and whatever your life is, you're balancing all of that. So is that family, friends, it's so different for everybody. And I've always said that is a myth that will never, it's really a little bit like unicorns and the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow and Xanadu, right? It's like, these things probably don't exist. And my views run a little counter, but I deal with it, hashtag deal with it is one of my values. You got to deal with what you're dealt with and then do the best you can. Adversity, mistakes. I always say Real Chemistry, great business, but it was a great business built on a bunch of mistakes well made. And when I really think you look at it and you say, you always have to go down the hill, the steep ski hill. You got to either break the ski or get snow down your butt, crack. And, I always say, like, those are the things that really teach you that, okay, I'm fine. I can keep going. I can keep conquering this mountain. And I really feel like you just have to deal with what's dealt to you and not really lament it too much. It's really what I always say to everyone. If a client gets upset, it's not that they're upset. It's how we react to it. If we don't do a great job, if we clean it up quick, we acknowledge what's been done and we move on quickly, then I think usually things go well.
That's awesome. Obviously, you talk about, moving on and conquering. You've been named one of the most important people in global public relations. You've been named a top innovator in communications, just to name a few. And you serve, as I mentioned, in leadership roles and various nonprofits, including the Cancer Research Institute. You've got a lot on your plate. You're a family man. Where do you go from here? What's next?
I don't totally know. I think I'm in a work in progress moment. I've talked to people about that. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I will probably entrepreneur again. I've tried a couple of things, and that's why I'm doing a lot of things and figuring out where can that focus is what led, the relentless focus is what led this company to grow the way it did. And, that you've got to have to create new entities. You can't be doing 500 different things. You got to be really focused. But I want to make sure it's something of great purpose and impact and I think fun for people. So my gut is that there's another one in me. What that other one is exactly, I'm taking a little time to figure out. It took a long time to get into Weiss that became WCG. I was working in the corporate world for many years. I was really about 39 when I started that in real earnest. So when I really think about it, there's no reason to rush immediately into a next thing. It may be happening and I don't know it yet, right? It's probably in progress. And I just think you got to stay open to the possibilities. The world is quite, I'd say, fluid these days. I'm not that negative on it. I know some people are, but I think you have to stay flexible, fluid, in order to adapt to what's next. And then I think the right thing will be, I'll take the right thing. I'm very big on taking the river versus the river taking me, but you do have to get into flow and figure out where that is. Again, that was a lot of the branding around W2O Group, the water sign, and staying fluid and being open to what's next.
Well, that's a good teaser. We'll all have to stand by because there are many exciting opportunities coming up in the future, I'm sure, for not only your companies, but also you personally. And I have 100 more questions, but I know we're running out of time. So I got to say, Jim, it's been great talking with you today. Thanks so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Appreciate your time.
Me too, Todd. Thanks for even choosing me. And thanks, Henry, out there for I ran into him at an event and he's like, oh, right, you should be on this podcast. So, I do my own, which I really have enjoyed. And I think it's important. These dialogues always open up ideas. There's always some interesting thing. And I think for the people that do tune in, they get something out of it. And it does create new opportunities. So I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to hang out and talk about not just what was, but more importantly, what's next. Always look ahead.
Absolutely. Well, that's awesome, Jim. We've been talking with Jim Weiss, a transformative leader in healthcare, founder and chairman of Real Chemistry. To learn more about Jim and his team, visit realchemistry.com. And to see how the Weiss family is investing in tomorrow's leaders, visit newhouse.syracuse.edu. This is Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers, sponsored by AM Skyer Insurance, a family insurance business started in 1920. Again, I'm Todd Stevens. Jim, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Todd.
Keep dreaming and doing.